In August 1914, a gun the size of a house rolled up to the Belgian fort at Lonsen and put a shell down through 10 feet of reinforced concrete. The magazine underneath detonated. Most of the garrison was buried where they stood. That gun had been built in a factory in Essen, Germany, by a family firm that also made the seamless steel wheels running under half the trains in Europe. That was 1914. By 1948, the man who owned that factory was standing in a Nuremberg courtroom, on trial for slavery. This is Trade Archive, where we take apart the companies that built the physical world and look at what was actually inside them. If this is the kind of history you want more of, like the video and subscribe. It decides which empire we open up next. The thing Friedrich Krupp spent his entire fortune chasing would eventually kill more people than any product his family ever made. In 1811, it was just a metallurgical puzzle that nobody in Germany had solved. The Krupps appear in the Essen town records in 1587, when a trader named Arndt Krupp joined the Merchants' Guild just ahead of a plague outbreak and got rich buying property from people fleeing the city. His son Anton ran a small gunsmithing operation during the 30 Years' War. For the next century and a half, the family stayed what the ledgers say they were: merchants and landlords. The one who changed the trajectory was a woman. Helene Amalie Krupp was widowed in 1757 and ran the family trading house for over 50 years, pushing it into cloth, porcelain, English trade, and coal, and in 1800 buying an ironworks called Good Hope at Sterkrade. Her grandson Friedrich ran that ironworks for her, and he ran it badly. He burned through his fuel supply in the winter of 1807, produced iron that could not match the works next door, and agreed to step aside. She sold it in 1808 at a profit, well before she died. The popular version has Friedrich inheriting a functioning ironworks. He did not. He inherited money, and then he spent it. He spent it on crucible steel. In 1811, the finest steel in the world came from Sheffield, England, using a process perfected by Benjamin Huntsman around 1740, and the English guarded the details the way a state guards a weapons program. Napoleon's continental system had cut mainland Europe off from British supply, so whoever cracked the process would own a continent-sized market. On the 20th of November, 1811, Friedrich Krupp founded a factory in Essen for the manufacture of English cast steel, with two partners named von Ketchel, who turned out to be useless. The process is simple to describe and almost impossible to execute. You seal bar steel inside a lidded clay crucible, lower it into a coke-fired hole in the floor, and hold it at white heat for hours until the metal goes fully liquid, which drives out the slag and leaves a dense, uniform, predictable steel. Then you lift the glowing crucible with tongs and pour. The clay has to survive temperatures that destroy most clay. The carbon has to be judged by eye, and the pour has to be fast, because a crucible cooling in your hands is a ruined heat. Friedrich Krupp spent 15 years on it. Working with an engineer named Gottlob Jacobs, he had usable cast steel by 1816, and the Dusseldorf Mint confirmed its quality in 1817. His products were narrow and unglamorous. Dies for stamping coins, tools for tanners, unfinished rolls. Demand never covered what the experiments cost, and by the early 1820s he had given up the family house and moved his wife and children into the small overseer's cottage beside the works. The company later kept that cottage as a shrine and called it the Stammhouse, which is a very particular kind of corporate storytelling, turning the founder's humiliation into scripture. Friedrich Krupp died on the 8th of October, 1826, at 39. Legend says he passed the secret of cast steel to his 14-year-old son on his deathbed. What the record shows is a near-bankrupt works, a handful of employees, and a widow named Therese, who became the legal owner. The boy went to work. Alfred Krupp left school at 14 and never went back. For 20 years, the firm barely survived, employing around 120 people as late as 1845. The cash that let it grow came from a machine his brother Hermann built for rolling spoons, which Alfred patented in 1841. He also went to England. The version you have probably heard has him checking into a Sheffield hotel under a false name with fake spurs on his boots, stealing British manufacturing secrets. Historians who have worked through the correspondence treat that with real skepticism. He traveled to Britain in 1838 and 1839. He used a lightly disguised name, and he was certainly watching how the English worked. But he was mostly there to sell steel and measure how far behind he was. What he brought home was an accurate estimate of the gap and a permanent case of Anglophilia. He spelled his own name Alfred for the rest of his life. Everything changed at the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. Krupp put a single flawless ingot of cast steel on the floor of the Crystal Palace, weighing about 2 tons, more than double anything cast before, and took the council medal. Popular accounts inflate it to 4 tons. 2 is what the record supports, and 2 was astonishing enough. To make it, his men had to melt roughly 98 separate crucibles and pour them into one mold in near-perfect sequence. If one crew was slow, the metal already in the mold began to set, and you had a flawed casting the size of a car. Beside it, he displayed a polished 6-pounder cannon in cast steel, one of the only weapons at an exhibition dedicated to peace. The money, though, came from railways. In 1852, Krupp developed a seamless railway tire, forged and rolled as one piece with no weld anywhere in it. Iron tires cracked at the weld, and when a tire failed at speed, the train came off the line. Krupp's did not crack. Every major railway in Europe and America became a customer, and the firm took 3 railway tires, stacked one over another, as its trademark in December 1875. They are still on the logo today, and they are usually described as interlocking rings. They are not interlocking. They are 3 superimposed wheels. To forge at that scale, he needed force. In 1861, he installed a steam hammer called Fritz, with a falling weight of about 50 tons, the most powerful in the world for the next 16 years. Krupp brought in the Bessemer converter in 1862, the first on the European continent, and Germany's first open hearth furnace in 1869. But he kept making crucible steel for the parts that killed people when they failed. Gun barrels stayed crucible work. Krupp cast his first steel cannon, a 3-pounder, in 1847, and the Prussian army wanted nothing to do with it. Their reasoning was not stupid. Bronze guns bulged when they failed. Steel guns burst, and early Krupp steel breech loaders did burst, and did kill their own crews. The first serious Prussian order came in 1859. His first foreign buyers were Egypt, then Belgium in 1861, then Russia in 1863. Here is a correction worth making, because it is repeated everywhere. Krupp steel did not win the War of 1866 against Austria. Prussian field artillery in that war was still overwhelmingly bronze. The legend gets built 4 years later, in the Franco-Prussian War, where his steel breech loaders outranged and outshot French bronze muzzle loaders badly enough that the difference showed up in the casualty figures. The mechanical heart of it was the breech. The French used an interrupted screw. Krupp used a horizontal sliding wedge, a machined block that slid sideways across the back of the barrel and locked. It worked faster, it tolerated dirt better, and it demanded tolerances most workshops in Europe could not hold. For heavy guns, he built barrels in layers. An inner tube, then a series of steel hoops heated until they expanded, slid over the tube, and left to cool. As each hoop shrank, it clamped down on the layer beneath, so the barrel sat under permanent compression before a single round went through it. That is why Krupp guns took pressures that split solid forged barrels. By the 1870s, he was the cannon king, and he had built something stranger than an arms company. Krupp workers called themselves Kruppianer, and the firm gave them a sickness fund from 1836, a pension fund from 1855, a company store, a hospital, and entire housing colonies. In 1872, Alfred codified it in the Generalregulativ, 72 paragraphs that worked as a constitution for a private state. It offered security from cradle to grave, demanded a loyalty oath, and forbade any contact with trade unions or social democrats. Bismarck studied the model when he built Germany's national social insurance a decade later. He ruled it from a house above the valley. Villa Hugel went up between 1870 and 1873 in stone and steel with almost no wood in it, because Alfred was terrified of fire. Tourist material says 269 rooms. The Krupp Foundation's own reading of the plans says 399. The most famous story about him, that he had horse manure piled where the smell would reach his window because he thought it healthy, comes to us mainly through one 1968 book that later historians consider unreliable. What is documented is that in 1873, the crash known as the Gründerkrise nearly ended him. He had been expanding into Spanish ore and Dutch shipping just as credit vanished, and in 1874, a consortium arranged with the Prussian State Bank put 30 million marks in to keep the firm standing. The man who armed Prussia had to be bailed out by it. He died in July 1887. His son, Friedrich Alfred, had no interest in any of this. He was a serious amateur oceanographer who funded marine research and kept boats at Capri, and he handed operations to professionals. Under him, the workforce passed 40,000, and the firm bought the Germania shipyard at Kiel and solved armor plate. Around 1893, Krupp took the American Harvey process and improved on it. Harvey armor was nickel steel with carbon packed against the heated face for weeks. Krupp added chromium, carburized the face by playing carbon-rich coal gas across the hot plate instead of packing solids against it, then quenched with jets of water and oil in stages so hardness fell away gradually through the thickness. What came out had a glass-hard face over a tough, springy back, so a shell shattered on the surface instead of punching through. 12 inches of Krupp armor did the work of 13 inches of the American product, and it became the world standard, licensed to every serious naval power. Then, in 1902, the family had its first public catastrophe. Italian newspapers, and then on the 15th of November, the German social democratic paper Vorwärts published allegations that Friedrich Alfred had been paying for the company of young men on Capri. Under paragraph 175, that was a criminal offense in Germany. His wife Margaret had gone to the Kaiser about it, and she was placed in a sanatorium at Jena. 1 week after the article ran, Friedrich Alfred Krupp was dead at 48. The official cause was a cerebral hemorrhage. Almost every popular account calls it suicide. The honest answer is that nobody knows. There was no autopsy, the coffin was sealed, and the burial happened fast, which is what you would do to hide a suicide, and also what a panicking family does to end a scandal. Scholarly sources leave it open, and so should we. What is not in doubt is what happened at the graveside. Kaiser Wilhelm II attended in person and used the funeral to accuse the Social Democrats of killing his arms manufacturer with lies. The family filed a libel suit against the newspaper and then quietly dropped it. That left a 16-year-old girl owning Germany's most important defense contractor. Nobody in Berlin was willing to accept a young woman running the arsenal, so the Kaiser arranged Bertha Krupp's marriage personally. In October 1906, she married a career diplomat named Gustav von Bohlen und Halbach, and a royal decree let him put Krupp in front of his own name. He took the chair in 1909. Which is how the family name ended up on the most famous artillery piece in history. The 42-centimeter siege howitzer, officially the M. Garrat, weighed about 42.5 tons, threw a shell just over 9 kilometers, and managed roughly 8 rounds an hour. German troops called it Dicke Bertha, Big Bertha. Whether that was a nod to Bertha Krupp has never been established, despite every documentary saying so. At Liege in August 1914, these guns cracked open the Belgian forts, though most of the work was done by far more numerous 21-centimeter mortars. And Big Bertha is constantly confused with the Paris gun of 1918, a different Krupp weapon that threw shells 120 kilometers into the French capital. 2 guns, 1 reputation. Under the water, the Germania yard at Kiel was turning out the U-boats that nearly starved Britain out of the war. Then Germany lost, and the Treaty of Versailles came for Krupp by name. The firm was ordered to destroy its armaments machinery and go civilian. It built locomotives, trucks, and farm equipment, and it made 2 things that had nothing to do with war and outlasted everything that did. The first arrived in 1926 and was called Whittia, short for the German phrase meaning like diamond. It is tungsten carbide powder mixed with cobalt, pressed into shape, and then sintered, heated until the cobalt binds the carbide grains into a solid without ever fully melting them. It cuts steel at speeds that destroy conventional tool steel, and almost every machine shop on Earth still runs on carbide inserts descended from it. The second was Neurosta, Krupp's chrome-nickel stainless. The crown of the Chrysler Building, which went up in New York in 1930, is clad in Neurosta supplied under American license. 96 years of rain later, it still shines. Quietly, Gustav Krupp kept the weapon's capability alive offshore, funding a submarine design office in the Netherlands, buying into Bofors in Sweden, and running cover firms in Berlin, so the designs and the engineers stayed current while the German plants sat legally disarmed. And then, France came to collect. When Germany defaulted on reparations, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr in January 1923. On the 31st of March, a French detachment entered the Krupp motor garage in Essen to seize vehicles. Someone set off the factory sirens. Thousands of workers came out of the sheds, the troops felt surrounded, and they opened fire. 13 men were killed. Gustav turned the funeral into a national event, and the dead into martyrs. The French court-martialed him, sentenced him to 15 years, and released him after about 7 months once the Dawes Plan diffused the crisis. What the shooting left behind was a grievance that radicals spent the next 10 years feeding on. If this is holding your attention, hit subscribe. Trade Archive puts out one of these every week, and the next one is already in research. By 1933, the Krupp position had moved from cautious to committed. Gustav attended the meeting at Göring's residence that February, where German industry funded the Nazi election campaign, and went on to run the National Industry Association. Whether he was bankrolling Hitler before 1933 is contested, and the evidence points more toward a man who moved fast once the outcome was obvious than a true believer. His wife Bertha reportedly called Hitler that certain gentleman and found a reason to be ill when he toured the villa in 1934. Her son Alfred had no such reservations. He became a patron member of the SS and joined the party in 1938. After a stroke in 1941 left Gustav failing, Alfred took over in practice and then in law. In November 1943, Hitler signed a decree written for one family. The Lex Krupp dissolved the joint stock company and handed the entire enterprise to Alfred as a sole proprietorship, bypassing his siblings and the inheritance tax code in one stroke. The products of those years were the largest things Krupp ever built. The 80-centimeter railway gun, known as Schwerer Gustav, weighed around 1,350 tons, ran 47 meters end-to-end, and fired shells of between 5 and 7 tons. It broke into 5 units to move by rail and was reassembled on twin parallel tracks by a crew of hundreds. At Sevastopol in June 1942, it fired 48 rounds, one of which went through roughly 10 meters of concrete and detonated an ammunition magazine buried under a bay. Krupp gave the first gun to Hitler as a personal gift and only charged the state for the second. And then there is the part of this story that no amount of engineering respect survives. As German men went to the front, Krupp filled its plants with people who were not there voluntarily. The Nuremberg record puts the figure at approximately 100,000 forced laborers across the firm's operations, including prisoners of war, civilians seized in occupied territory, concentration camp inmates, and children. Roughly 23,000 were prisoners of war. The most repeated version of this places a Krupp factory called the Bertha Work at Auschwitz. That is wrong. The Bertha Work, named after Bertha Krupp, was an artillery plant at Markstadt in Silesia, supplied with labor from Pfunteichen, the largest satellite camp in the Gross-Rosen system. Prisoners there built 75 and 150 mm guns and torpedo launchers. Krupp separately contracted to build a fuse plant inside Auschwitz itself using camp inmates. There was a camp on Humboldtstrasse in Essen holding around 520 Hungarian Jewish women, selected in person by Krupp officials. And at Voorda, there was a facility for the infants of Eastern forced laborers, a nursery in name that functioned as something else entirely. Allied troops found Alfred at Villa Hugel in 1945. By one account, he came down the stairs objecting in English that he was merely a businessman. The prosecution then made one of the most embarrassing errors of the entire Nuremberg process. The indictment at the main international military tribunal named Gustav Krupp, who was by then senile and medically unfit to stand trial. When the Allies asked to substitute his son, the tribunal refused. So no Krupp appeared at the main trial at all. Alfred and 11 of his executives were tried separately, in Case 10 of the subsequent proceedings, from December 1947 to July 1948. They were acquitted of planning aggressive war. They were convicted of plunder across occupied Europe and of the enslavement and mistreatment of forced labor. The tribunal specifically rejected the defense that the firm had no choice, the argument that had partly worked in earlier industrialist cases. At one point, the defense lawyers walked out of the courtroom and were held in contempt. Alfred Krupp was sentenced to 12 years and the forfeiture of his entire fortune. He served 3. On the 31st of January, 1951, the American High Commissioner for Germany, John McCloy, commuted the sentences and, far more consequentially, gave Alfred his property back. West Germany was the front line against the Soviet Union now, and Washington wanted the Ruhr running. Telford Taylor, who had led the prosecution at Nuremberg, called it a blow to the principles of international law. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote to McCloy asking why so many Nazis were being released. A Washington Post cartoonist drew him opening the cell door while Stalin photographed it from behind. You will often see Churchill added to that list of critics. There is no solid source for it. The man who rebuilt the company had spent the war doing the opposite of everything Krupp had done. Berthold Beitz managed oil fields in occupied Galicia and used his position to pull hundreds of Jewish workers off deportation trains by declaring them essential to petroleum production. Israel later recognized him as righteous among the nations. In 1953, Alfred Krupp made him his general plenipotentiary, which means the convicted slave labor employer hired the man who had saved Jews from the same system to be the public face of the company. Beitz modernized the firm, dropped the arms business, and chased contracts in the Soviet bloc, while everyone else was still pretending the Iron Curtain was solid. Compensation came slowly and grudgingly. Only in 1959 and 1960 did Krupp agree to pay Jewish survivors of its plants, and the fund ran out with claims still outstanding. Non-Jewish forced laborers got nothing for decades. The dynasty ended in a recession. West Germany's downturn in 1967 caught the firm carrying too much debt as a private proprietorship, and it survived only on state-backed guarantees, the price of which was becoming an ordinary corporation. There was no heir anyway. Alfred's only son, Arndt, wanted nothing to do with coal and steel and renounced the entire inheritance for an annual stipend of around 2 million marks. Alfred Krupp died of lung cancer in July 1967. Ownership passed to a charitable foundation in his name, chaired by Beitz, and the family's direct rule ended after 156 years. For 2 decades, the foundation ran a large, respectable, slightly sleepy industrial group. Then Gerhard Krumm arrived, and the old aggression came back wearing a different suit. In 1991, Krupp quietly accumulated shares in Hoesch, another historic Ruhr steelmaker, working through bank intermediaries so that nobody could see the position building until he was at nearly 51%. The German business establishment was scandalized. Not because raiding was illegal, but because it was not done. Post-war German capitalism ran on cross-shareholdings, house banks, and quiet consensus, and hostile stake building was understood to be an American habit that stopped at the Atlantic. Krupp had used the Ruhr's own banking machinery against a Ruhr neighbor. The merger was backdated to the start of 1992, and in January 1993, Krupp listed publicly for the first time in its history. After 182 years, anyone with a brokerage account could own a piece of it. Then he did it again, to someone much larger. In March 1997, Krupp launched a hostile takeover bid for Thyssen worth about 13.5 billion marks. Thyssen was the bigger firm, founded in 1871 and every bit as embedded in the Ruhr. The response was not a boardroom argument. It was a street fight. Thousands of Thyssen steelworkers marched on the Frankfurt banks financing the bid and blockaded the entrances. Krupp was denounced as a job killer and pelted with eggs and tomatoes. Politicians attacked the whole idea of Anglo-American finance being pointed at a German employer, and the argument stopped being about steel and became a referendum on what kind of capitalism Germany intended to be. The bid collapsed within weeks. The two companies went to the table instead and merged their flat steel operations that September, and the full merger was entered in the commercial register on the 17th of March, 1999. The new logo set the Thyssen arch beside the three Krupp wheels, which is a fairly elegant way of saying that after a century of rivalry, neither side had actually won. The other reckoning arrived at almost the same moment. Through the 1990s, class action suits in American courts and mounting public pressure forced German industry back to the forced labor question it had settled far too cheaply in 1960. In 2000, the German government and around 6,500 companies established a joint foundation, Remembrance, Responsibility and Future, capitalized at 10 billion marks, to pay surviving forced and slave laborers directly. It paid out to more than 1.5 million people across almost 100 countries. It arrived 55 years late, and for most of the men and women who built guns at Markstedt, it arrived after they had died. Then the company did something genuinely unusual. For its 200th anniversary in 2011, it opened its historical archive to an outside historian, the Princeton scholar Harold James, and published the resulting book without controlling the conclusions. Corporations commission histories all the time. Very few of them hand over the files on the slave labor years and then print what comes back. It is the single clearest sign that the institution had stopped defending the family and started studying it. Berthold Beitz outlasted almost everyone. He chaired the foundation into his 90s and died in 2013 at 99. A man whose one life connected the platforms in Galicia, where he pulled people off the trains, to the boardroom of the company whose plants those trains were feeding. Villa Hügel is a museum now. Alfred Krupp's fireproof fortress above the Ruhr, with its 399 rooms and its ventilation system that never worked, holds art exhibitions and wedding receptions, and downstairs sits the historical archive that the family spent a century deciding who was allowed to read. You can buy a ticket, walk the hall where the Kaiser was entertained, and then go down and look at the ledgers. What has happened since is the slow dismantling of what Alfred Krupp assembled. In February 2020, ThyssenKrupp sold its elevator division to a private equity consortium for 17.2 billion euros. That division was the single most profitable thing the group owned, the reliable earnings engine that had been quietly subsidizing the steel business for years, and the money went straight into pensions and debt rather than into anything new. It was a company selling its best organ to keep the body alive. In 2023, it floated ThyssenKrupp Nucera, which builds industrial-scale water electrolysis plants for green hydrogen, raising around €526 million in what was then the largest hydrogen listing ever done. In 2024, it sold 20% of the steel business to the Czech investor Daniel Kretinsky and announced that steel would shed around 11,000 jobs, 5,000 cut outright by 2030, and the rest pushed out through sales and spin-offs, from a workforce of roughly 27,000. The union called it a catastrophe. In the towns around Duisburg and Bochum, where 3 and 4 generations of the same families have worked the same furnaces, the argument was not really about tonnage or carbon targets. It was about whether the Ruhr is still a place where a man without a degree can earn a decent living making something heavy, or whether that era finished and nobody had told them. The replacement for the blast furnace is going up at Duisburg. It is a direct reduction plant designed to make iron with hydrogen instead of coke, rated at 2.5 million tons a year and around 3.5 million tons of avoided carbon dioxide, backed by roughly €2 billion of German state support. It is running late. The original target was the end of 2026, and the realistic date now sits closer to the end of the decade. The men on those furnaces in Duisburg are the direct professional descendants of the crews who poured 98 crucibles in sequence for a London exhibition in 1851, and they are being asked to do the same thing Friedrich Krupp was asked to do: make a metal a new way before the money runs out. And then, in October 2025, the oldest business in the house came back. ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems, the direct descendant of the Kiel yard that built the Kaiser's U-boats, was spun off and listed in Frankfurt, opening at €60 a share with an order backlog of €18.6 billion. Europe was rearming. In the most recent financial year, the parent reported sales of €32.8 billion, with order intake up 15%, driven almost entirely by warships. The healthiest thing the group owns is submarines again. The Alfred Krupp Foundation still holds 20.93% of the shares, which means the charity built out of a convicted war criminal's restored fortune is the anchor investor in a European defense contractor. Which brings us back to Lonsin. The fort is still there outside Liège, left as it fell in 1914, with the dead still under the concrete. It is a war grave now, and you can walk the rim of the crater the shell made. The company that built the gun is currently a holding company trying to work out how to make iron without coal. 215 years of the same argument runs through all of it. Krupp made the seamless wheel that stopped trains derailing, the carbide tool half the world's machinists still use, and the stainless steel on the Chrysler Building. It also made the gun at Lonsin, the armor on the ships, the fuses at Auschwitz, and the artillery at Markstedt built by men who were worked until they could not stand. The same crucible process, the same forge presses, the same obsessive metallurgy sat underneath both columns. The steel was never the moral variable. The customer was. If you want more stories like this one, the next one is on screen right now. See you there.